today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today our subject deals with Latin America. In fact, we may discuss all of South America, but we're going to stress Latin America, Central America. We have a guest today who is certainly qualified to discuss this very important subject. And as you know, in recent months there's been a lot of discussion in our country about our foreign policy in such places as Nicaragua and what we might do, and the Contra issue. Our guest is Dr. Don Irish, who holds a doctorate degree from the University of Washington in Seattle. He has taught for years at the University of Minnesota, and while there he was chair of the Department of Sociology from 1963 through 1979. He has also been a Fulbright twice, in 1972 in Colombia and in 1979 in Uruguay. He has written lots on this subject and many others. He has a very distinguished academic background. He is also active in a number of organizations, not only in this country, but again with all his trips to South America. Dr. Irish, it was our pleasure to meet you earlier today and enjoyed your discussion with our students, and we welcome you to our campus and we look forward to this interview.
Thank you.
And I'm very happy to welcome panelists Steve Schenck, who is Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and Steve shall commence the questioning.
Thank you, Tony. Dr. Irish, I know you just returned from an extensive tour of Central America, and I wonder if you might set the stage for our discussions today by kind of painting us a picture of the social and economical and political backdrop of the various nations in that part of the country.
Certainly, and if I might make one correction, I'm now adjunct professor at the University of Minnesota, but I was chair of the department at Hamline University in St. Paul from 1963 to 1979, so I would not want the University of Minnesota to claim me for that period of time. Central America is defined by, I think, political scientists and others of us as the 5 republics, including Guatemala, Honduras, Salvador, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. Mesoamerica sometimes includes Panama and Mexico. There are reasons for this historically, because under the Spaniards, the viceroy under Spain was centered in Guatemala and comprised those 5 countries. And in the 1800s, they were at one time, more than one time, a confederacy of 5 countries. So they have a regional sense. All the 5 countries have America Central or Central America on their license plates. All the money has volcanoes on them. All the flags are blue and white, except for Costa Rica, which has a bit of red. So they have, and there are a lot of organizations like Boy Scouts and others which have the Central American organization. So they think of themselves as a region, and they don't think of themselves as part of Panama or part of Mexico. So when we're talking about Central America here, I'm referring to those 5 republics. They're all very, each one different, each with their own history, even though they have this sense of regionalism. And I think that's what's brought forward now. The Arias plan is that these 5 have come to the point where they feel that they want to revivify their associations. The economic common market, which began in '61, sort of died with the Honduran-Salvadoran War, and they now are trying to revivify that common market in Central America. President Cerezo of Guatemala, as you know, has now asked for the election of a Central American parliament to begin to be elected in 1988. So there's a consciousness of this. When you have strong people like Somoza or others, it's very difficult to get people together. Who's going to be the big cheese? But now you have 5 presidents, all technically elected, though some more democratic than others, who see that if things are not changed, it could be a devastating regional war, which is bad for all of them. So I think that's come together. Now, I don't know how long we want to belabor each one. We could go down each of the 5 and say something about them if you wanted more coverage of that, but that's what we mean by the region, and that's some of the history which has kept them together, and the symbolism which they recognize in common.
That's excellent, thank you. I wonder, again, with the aim of trying to give our viewers something of a background for our further discussions, to a casual observer, it often seems that the United States is more interested in events that take place halfway around the world than we are in the events in Central America and Mexico and in Latin America, which are countries, relatively speaking, right on our own doorstep. Is there a reason for that, and what do you feel is the reason why people in this country should be concerned about events in Central America?
Well, you may be right. I'm not sure that there's a greater interest in things that far away inherently, though I grant you there's a lot more publicity. What we have now, at least in recent days, is almost an invisible war. And it's been kept that way, I think, intentionally. I'm sure the audience remembers in the days of Vietnam, seeing the bombing, the napalming, even the assassinations right on the screen. So it came home, plus the fact of many American bodies coming home. In Central America, we don't see the bombing of the Salvadoran villages, the use of napalm. We don't see the 100,000 Indians in Guatemala who have been assassinated by the military. We don't see the strategic hamlets that are enclosing Indian communities after they've destroyed 75 of the villages, whereas in Vietnam there were the same strategic hamlets. They speak of it as low-intensity conflict, as our Pentagon does. It's something they learned from Vietnam. I think it's the wrong thing to learn, but they're very sophisticated in applying this concept. So that you have a very real war going on down there. It's not low intensity for them. But for the American people, we have very few bodies coming home. There's Ben Linder, and there are a few volunteers who have been killed. And the Hasenfuss had 2 pilots killed, and I was in Santa Clara, Nicaragua, when a helicopter went down with some Alabama civil military assistance people. There have been a few, but for the most part, we don't have American bodies coming home. And so, regrettably, it's, I suppose, sort of human nature that if your own are not involved, you're less immediately concerned. And so, for many Americans, it's an invisible sort of thing, but it's very real down there. On the other hand, I would say that we have been very interested. I don't have details to repeat here, there isn't time, but we have repeatedly invaded, for instance, 13 times in Nicaragua, several times in Honduras, 3 times in Cuba, many times in Mexico. We have constantly intervened, and so it's obviously it's been of our interest. We've not ignored Latin America as an official policy. And that stems greatly from, well, it even goes back to Jefferson and Washington. You'll find quotations of the notion of manifest destiny. It's our prerogative to not only control the whole continent and drive the Indians off their land, but it's somehow our destiny to control this whole hemisphere. And then in 1823, of course, you had the Monroe Doctrine, which quite explicitly says that we would look with disfavor at any other foreign intrusion. It was then Europe, Spain and France and England we were concerned about. There was no Soviet Union. And implicitly, though my colleague here in poli-sci probably has it better in mind, implicitly it indicates that we then would stay out of other people's hemispheres. It's not quite as explicit as the contrary. But we obviously have completely forgotten that. We say nobody should be here, but we are obviously, the Pentagon said we're prepared to fight 2.5 wars around the world at the same time. So I think our whole history has been one of viewing this, we often say, as our backyard, as if it somehow belonged to us, and we had the right to determine its destiny. And it's that attitude of the American people which I think desperately needs to be examined and I think changed. And it's not a partisan matter. This has happened under Democratic presidents, it's happened under Republican presidents. Just taking a recent history since World War II. Under Eisenhower, we had the CIA effort overthrew the government of Guatemala, the Democratic elected governor of Guatemala under Arbenz, and put in Armas, a military man in his place. And in the succeeding years of generals, you had 100,000 Indians killed in Guatemala in 30 years since we overthrew that government. Under Kennedy, we of course had the Bay of Pigs. Eisenhower regime started it, but Kennedy implemented it, which was a fiasco. It was another attempt to invade another country, overthrow its government, and there were assassination plans against Fidel Castro. Under Mr. Johnson, we were in Dominican Republic. Under Nixon, the CIA helped overthrow Allende in Chile, and Mr. Reagan obviously is now involved in trying to overthrow the government in Nicaragua. So it's not a partisan matter. I'm not concerned about Democratic, Republican. I'm concerned about the basic American policy toward Latin America, which I think needs to be changed. England finally got to recognize that they could no longer control India, nor should, and their colonies under pressure were released. France likewise, after a bloody battle in Algeria and elsewhere, finally released its colonies. Now, we don't have direct political control in sense of India with England, but we have a lot of economic and other military interventions and military threats, which in a sense makes us likewise imperial in trying to control Western Hemisphere. And it's that attitude which I deeply feel as an American citizen we need to change.
I would like to pursue this in relation to a very contemporary issue. There's a great debate going on in Washington, D.C. between the administration, the Reagan administration, and some members of Congress and others in this country concerning Nicaragua and the aid to the Contras. And as I view it, the great debate tends to take place between military aid to the Contras versus some kind of major change in the economic and social systems of Central America, including Nicaragua, and aid that's called humanitarian aid is a label that's given. I'd like to get your viewpoint in about a two-part question. First of all, what is your position concerning this attempt at military solution through aiding the Contras? And number two, how do you side with those individuals that would like to take a look at revamping the policy and dealing with development of schools and roads and other types of humanitarian economic aid, not only in Nicaragua but all of Central America?
Well, first let's take the Contra aid matter. As people might suspect, my view is that it should be discontinued. It's not just Nicaragua, however. We're also supporting, as you know, aid to Salvador. Half its budget comes from our aid, and its army is killing its own people in that revolution. They're not identical, however, because the Salvadoran rebels are indigenous. They control about a third of the country. They obviously have support of a lot of the people, or they could not survive. They get a lot of their arms by either corruption, buying them from Salvadoran military, or capturing them. They're not, greatly aided by an outside force. Whereas the Contras are a creation of our own CIA. It's true, there were some Somocista National Guardsmen who were resistant after the war, after the overthrow of Somoza, but they're relatively few hundred people. We, the CIA, recruited and trained and armed and financed and direct the Contras. So they are mercenary soldiers substituting for American soldiers to accomplish our foreign policy. So I think we need to distinguish between the differences of these two so-called rebel groups. It's not a civil war in Nicaragua. It's a mercenary army representing an outside force trying to overthrow a government, which has been, I think, legitimately established. We recognize it. We have an embassy there, and Latin American scholars and political scientists recognize those elections as legitimate. So those things are different. I think the Contra aid, obviously, would sabotage, would torpedo the Arias plan. The Arias plan says all aid to irregular military forces by outside countries should be stopped. The Contadora plan also had the same arrangements. And the Contadora nations, as I think the audience knows, consists of those countries that represent 80% of the Latin American people. And they are all countries with democratic elected office presidents, more or less, democratic. And four of them, the Contadora group, are the four countries closest to Central America. Presumably would have the most to risk. If there's communism, presumably most to fear. And yet you have Mexico, Panama, Venezuela, and Colombia, who are the Contadora group, saying no Contra aid, no foreign maneuvers, send the foreign advisors home, and so forth. Then you have the support group of Peru, Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil, all with democratically elected presidents, who make eight nations. And then you have the 5 presidents now who agree on the Arias plan, so you have 13 Latin American nations agreeing. You have the European Economic Unity, you have the Vatican, you have the UN General Assembly, and the OAS have all voted to support the Arias plan. So the American administration is really quite politically isolated on insisting on Contra aid. The Contra, as far as I'm concerned, are the leaders. 46 of the 48 military leaders are former Somocista National Guardsmen. That's why in Nicaragua they don't call them freedom fighters, they call them La Guardia, because that's where the leadership comes from. Now the average Contra foot soldier is, most of them, poor peasants who have been bought. And if you're poor, you can be bought. In our own country, blacks and Hispanics are enlisted in the army. It's one way they can get an income, one way to get a steady job. And the thing happens there likewise in Nicaragua. They are mostly poor peasants. I'm not therefore saying they're all Somocistas, but the leadership is. And the Arias plan says no more aid. Mr. Arias has been in Washington recently pleading with the President Reagan, please give us time, no aid. Mr. Cerezo said the same thing. Duarte was just there yesterday, day before yesterday, kissing the American flag and said, Mr. President, no Contra aid. So that my position, in a sense, is that of the majority of world opinion and that of Latin America. That's the first question, and we could say more about the Contras if you wish. They are not freedom fighters. They attack health clinics, teachers, medical doctors, engineers, and they try to avoid any contact with Sandinista army. The militia are all over the country of Nicaragua. The people are well armed, like in Switzerland. Almost every home has a gun. That's actually a sign of trust in the people. You wouldn't dare arm all the Guatemalan Indians or arm all the Honduran peasants, or they'd overthrow the government, I think. To come to your second question, which I need to have maybe reformulated again.
Yes, in the debate concerning military aid, if you indicated there's a great debate in this country from another faction that says that it really shouldn't be military aid. That's not the solution. It's through economic aid and humanitarian aid to the peoples of the countries.
Thank you. Let's take humanitarian aid first. This word has been misused, as it often is in propaganda. We use euphemisms, and like calling Contras freedom fighters when Amnesty International and America's Watch and others can document that they have been doing a lot of terrorist activities. Likewise, humanitarian aid has been misused. The United Nations definition says humanitarian aid should be administered by an international, impartial agency to all sides of the conflict without regard to ideology, and not aid to one of the parties to the conflict. So when Mr. Reagan says we're getting humanitarian aid by sending boots and uniforms to the Contras, that does not meet international law definitions of humanitarian aid. Any more than, again, I've been past president of the Middle East Peace Now. I'm not unaware of the complications in the Middle East, but if we told the American public in Congress we wanted to send humanitarian aid to the PLO, what would the American people say? They'd say, you're maintaining an army, you're maintaining a military force. That's exactly what humanitarian aid to the Contras is doing. It's not humanitarian in that sense. New York Times had a page not long ago in which it had on the same page an article in which the State Department had refused to allow to be sent seeds and agricultural tools to Nicaragua as humanitarian aid. The same page indicated they allowed a far-right religious group to send helicopters to the Contras. So humanitarian aid gets, defined in very odd ways. In terms of if it's genuine humanitarian aid, these people need potable water. You could do more for the health of these countries if they just had clean water and sanitation. They don't need heart-lung machines. They need just basic health care, preventative health care. They need money to help with their literacy campaigns. They need jobs. They need land. And one doesn't need communism to explain these revolts. You have in Salvador 14 families that control most of the country's land and power. You have over 50% unemployment. You have a great deal of malnutrition. You have people without land that can't even grow their own rice and beans, while we are shipping sugar cane and bananas and coffee to the United States and the rest of the world. These are the basic causes of the problem, and so humanitarian aid of that nature would be very helpful and very welcome. I think it ought to be done multilaterally, not bilaterally. I think when you have a big, powerful country negotiating with a small, weak country, it's hardly an equal bargain, and almost always we do it for our own advantage. I'd much rather see the health program done through the World Health Organization, the agricultural work done through the FAO, and help those interests that are trying to get justice, because without justice you won't get peace. And so humanitarian in the true sense, yes, and we could be very helpful. And we could make these people raise their standard of living. They'd be better customers of ours. They're not antagonistic toward us. It's amazing how friendly we are received as persons. They separate us from the government policy. Never had much hostility. Sometimes you have some sneering remarks about Yankee, but for the most part, personally, they're very receptive, very warm, very generous. Even in Nicaragua, which would have every reason to be hostile, any of you in the audience could fly to Nicaragua tomorrow without a visa and be admitted. But we don't let all of them come, Central Americans come here. We've just had a refusal by our embassy to let one of the Central Americans come here who's the head of the organization, that Adolfo Pérez Esquivel, the Nobel Prize winner from Argentina in 1980. she's head of his office, and the State Department will not give her a visa to come and talk about the conditions there. Even though we had a letter from Congressman Vento of Minnesota, we had letters from college presidents. So our society is not quite as open to all views as we would like. So humanitarian aid, yes, and they would welcome us. Doctors, nurses, teachers, if they'll speak Spanish, and be willing to make the sacrifices, yes.
Dr. Irish, recently President Arias of Costa Rica received the Nobel Peace Prize for his plan and his work. At the time of taping this show, which is on October the 19th, it won't air for a little while, but what do you think, based on this given day, by the time it airs, things may change, but what impetus does that award for him do to the peace plan? Does that make it more likely to take place, or does that put more pressure on the United States to support his plan?
It's not usual sometimes to give an award to somebody when something's in process and has not been accomplished, but as the Swedish group pointed out, they didn't think that was amiss, that was one way of advancing peace. So I do think it gives more psychological leverage upon the United States administration to consider carefully and reconsider their view. It will help Arias, I think, and the plan. I'm cautiously hopeful, but knowing what's going on behind the scenes, both with Contadora and with the Arias plan, I confess I have fears that it will be subverted in various ways by those who do not want a peaceful negotiation in Central America, but want to have a military solution.
Okay, thank you. Steve Sheen.
Dr. Irish, what have you been able to determine as the Cuban presence in Nicaragua? Is that real? Is it a concern?
It's real, but it's not at all secret. The Nicaraguan officials will tell you, yes, we have several thousand Cubans here. Most of them are teachers, doctors, nurses. We've met some of them. My wife's a dietitian. We've been in the hospitals. They're not necessarily beloved any more than anybody else is automatically beloved. Some actually were resented. They do, of course, speak the language. They know the culture, and they're willing to be available. However, Nicaragua has several hundred United States citizens there. We outnumber all of their groups of volunteers from Western Europe, except the West Germans. There are many Western Europeans and United States citizens there. We don't hear about them. There are some Cuban military advisors. That's not a secret matter either. I'm not privy to the exact numbers, and depending upon your viewpoint, I mean, some people will say thousands and some will say hundreds. But our own Pentagon has readily stated that the Nicaraguan military is defensive only. They have no long-range missiles or artillery. They have no fighter bombers. They have no bombers. They have a putt-putt navy. They do have their people organized with guns and rifles and machine guns, but it's a defensive thing because they've been attacked since 1981. So there are Cubans there, but we must not assume that they're running the show. I do not believe they are. Nicaragua has three principles established after overthrowing Somoza. They want to have a mixed economy, which they do have. 50% of the industry and business in private hands, 60% of the land is in private hands. They want to have a plural polity. They had 7 parties run in the elections, which the Latin American Studies Association says was an accurately counted and fair election. And having worked in our own Deep South during the Civil Rights struggle, having worked in Chicago under the Kelly Nash machine, I can assure you our elections are not necessarily perfect either, in terms of either lacking corruption or making access to everybody. So that's the second principle. The third principle is non-alignment. They did not fight Somoza and lose 40, 50,000 dead and many, many thousands more wounded just to be somebody else's puppet. So even though they do have reliance upon Cuba for some of these needs, and although they do certainly, it's not secret, get arms from the Soviet Union, Iran-Contra hearings also indicated that our CIA is buying arms from Poland and Bulgaria and shipping them to Central America. So we need a broader picture. We stopped them from buying planes from France. We declined to send them any military things ourselves, and so a country that's being under attack will seek aid where it can get it. But I can assure you they do not want to be anybody's puppet. And those are their 3 principles which they will try to adhere to when they're given the chance to determine their own destiny.
And what's your opinion of the administration's fears that Nicaragua will become an attempt to export communism to other nations in Central America?
I have a dim view of that. I don't think you export revolutions. I could expound to the American people at length, and I couldn't make them revolt if they're satisfied with their society. It's because of the poverty and the injustice and the lack of land and the lack of jobs that these people are in revolt against Salvador, in revolt against Guatemala, and revolted against Somoza. You don't need communism to explain that. Now, this doesn't say they're not Marxists there, but they're also Marxists in the French Parliament and the Italian Parliament, and we deal with the Soviet Union and China and Yugoslavia without any great problem. Why does that become a great problem in Nicaragua? If they were allowed to be that, I think they would be a social democracy. They belong not to the Communist International, they belong to the Socialist International, along with the Labour Party in Britain, the Swedish Labour Party, Willy Brandt's German Social Democratic Party. That's their orientation. But if you push people, you can radicalize them. You attack them, then they put in censorship of the press. You attack them from 81 to 84, and after 3 years they put in a military draft. We have done the same thing in times of emergency. So you can blame the victim. You can make them, if I get antagonistic to you enough, you'll begin to dislike me probably, unless you're a great spirit and greatly forgiving. And so if you attack a country and embargo them, and you use maneuvers to psychologically threaten an invasion, it's no wonder that they may be radicalized. But that's not what their basic philosophy is, in spite of what many people out in the audience may believe or been told by our administration. It is not communist Nicaragua. And I could justify that very readily by giving you a litany of things that would not be found in a communist country.
In about 30 seconds, what is your prediction? We're running out of time. Concerning the resolution of this issue in the United States, do you think that the contra aid will be given or will it be denied? And how much will you be behind the peace proposal that's been brought forth?
Well, I'm not a political scientist. I'm not quite as versed perhaps in the congressional things. I suspect it's going to be very hard for Mr. Reagan to get contra aid this time with the Nobel Prize, with the Arias Plan, with the world opinion as it is. However, the regrettable thing is you do not find Democrats or other people basically criticizing our policy. And until they change they may say, well, we think that sandinistas are bad and we have a right, we should get rid of them, but not this way. So the problem is that the people who are opposed to contra aid are not necessarily of my view and with this historical perspective that I share, and therefore they're subject to maneuver. If you can get an incident created, you could galvanize the American people to support the president, probably.
Okay. With that, we're out of time. Dr. Don Irish, thank you very much. It's been most informative. And Steve, thank you for your questions. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Dr. Don Irish from Minnesota, speaking of Central America. Please join us again next week at this time. Until then, have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.